Agreed to meet. Iris was in Wisconsin, a different city than the house, 400 miles from it, which she had chosen deliberately and which she said had not been enough. I was in the city where I had returned after the archive, with Margaret's binder on my desk and the PDF of 37 names still open on my laptop. We agreed on a midpoint, a city neither of us had any prior connection to, which felt like the right kind of neutral ground, the kind of place that wouldn't have anything already layered onto it, any prior association for either of us to navigate around. We agreed on the following Thursday. We agreed we would bring everything we had, her 17 years of internal documentation, my 7 pages of notes, and the archive photographs I had taken on my phone. We agreed, without saying it explicitly, that we were treating this as the beginning of an investigation rather than the continuation of a haunting, that the shift in framing was not denial. It was a choice about what kind of agency we intended to exercise within a situation that had been, for a very long time, exercising agency on us. That night I went through the spreadsheet again, all 37 names, all the outcome codes, and I made a second list, separate from Kale's PDF, organized not by residency date, but by the outcome code and by what I had been able to find in public records. The C entries, the closed cases, were distributed across the archive without any pattern I could see at first. But when I sorted by decade, something appeared. The C entries were heavily clustered in the middle of the timeline, the 1920s through the 1980s. The W entries, the withdrawn cases like Margaret, were concentrated in the last 30 years. The dashes, the 4 unresolved cases with no public record, were distributed across the archive, one in the 1890s, one in the 1930s, one in 1974, and one that I had not noted carefully enough on first pass. The 4th dash was not historical, it was recent. The residency date in the 4th dash entry was 11 years ago, and the name beside it was not a stranger's. It was a name I had seen before, in the Covenant's supplementary documents, in a notation I had read and not yet understood, in Kale's email signature's reference to a predecessor. The 4th missing person was the lawyer who had managed the Covenant before Kale. I did not call Kale again that night. I sat with what I had found and I thought about the structure of what I was now inside, and I tried to be precise about what I knew and what I was inferring. What I knew: Kale's predecessor had been a designated witness. His predecessor had disappeared 11 years ago, leaving a dash in the archive where a resolution should be. Kale had been retained, by whom exactly was now in question, in the aftermath of that disappearance. What I was inferring: Kale's retention was not incidental to his predecessor's disappearance. The Covenant needed a lawyer to administer it, and when the prior one became a dash, whoever had taken over management of the trust had found a replacement. What I did not know was whether Kale understood any of this, or whether he had been told enough to function and not enough to ask the questions that would put him in the same position as the man he had replaced. I thought about his voice saying, "I'm not certain," and thought that 3 words could hold a great deal of fear if you were experienced enough at keeping fear out of your voice, and that Kale was experienced at exactly that. The last thing I did before I tried to sleep was go back to the spreadsheet and count forward from my name at the bottom. 37 designated witnesses. My name was number 37. I had been assuming the list was historical, names from the past, my name as the most recent addition, the end of a documented sequence. But the spreadsheet had columns for residency start and residency end, and the column for my residency end was not blank. It had a date, a future date, a date approximately 14 months from now. I looked at it for a long time. Someone had filled in the end date for my tenure as a witness before my tenure had begun. Someone had a schedule. Someone knew when my obligation, the obligation I had not accepted, the document I had not signed, was expected to conclude. And the date in that cell was not a guess or a projection. It had the quality of a fact that had already been decided. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark and thought about what it meant to be planned for, and whether the planning had ever needed my consent, and whether the entity in that house had ever been the most dangerous thing inside this structure. Thursday came. I drove 6 hours to the midpoint city and checked into a motel that faced the street, which I had chosen without entirely admitting why. Iris was already there when I arrived. She was standing in the parking lot, which told me she had not wanted to wait inside a closed room. She was older than the records I had found, which meant I had been working from outdated photographs. She had the look of someone who had spent a long time managing the amount of space they occupied in any given environment, careful, calibrated, aware of exits in a way that did not look like fear, because she had practiced it for long enough to make it look like preference. We shook hands and did not say anything meaningful in the parking lot because some conversations need a table between them and a door you can see. We went inside. We ordered coffee. She put a manila folder on the table and I put my notebook beside it, and we looked at each other across 17 years of separate experience of the same mechanism, and then she opened the folder. What Iris had compiled over 17 years was not a documentation of occurrences. It was a theory. She had spent those years building a model of the mechanism, using her own experience, using what she had been able to find in property records and historical archives about the house, using the marginal observations she had made during her residency that the protocol had not asked for, but that she had recorded anyway, because they seemed important, and she did not trust the official record to preserve things the Covenant did not want preserved. Her model was detailed and internally consistent, and it converged in its essential architecture with the understanding Iris and I had arrived at together on the phone, and with the second hypothesis she had named the feeding theory, the idea that witness attention was not containment but sustenance. But her model had an additional element that neither of us had reached independently. She had a timeline, not a schedule like the one in the spreadsheet, not a planned sequence of transitions, but a developmental timeline, a model of growth. And according to her model, the entity that the Covenant had been attending for 2 centuries was not the same size or the same kind of thing it had been when the first witness was designated in 1847. It had been growing. Incrementally, measurably, across every documented residency, it had been adding to itself, and her model projected, from the growth rate she had calculated, that it was very close to reaching a threshold she could not precisely define, but that every data point in her timeline curved toward. She called the threshold a saturation point, though she said the word with the careful qualification of someone using a term from an adjacent discipline because no term from the correct discipline existed. The idea was this: the entity had been sustained by witness attention, had grown through it, and was approaching a state in which the original container, the house, the property, the perimeter the witness presence reinforced, would no longer be proportionate to what the entity had become. The way a structure adequate to contain something at one scale becomes inadequate at a larger scale, not through any failure of the structure itself, but through the growth of what it was designed to hold. She said, "The boundary isn't collapsing because the mechanism is broken. It's collapsing because the thing inside it has outgrown it." And the new operators, whoever had taken over management of the Covenant in the last decade, had come in at exactly the point in the developmental timeline when that threshold was becoming visible. She set her coffee down and looked at me and said, "I don't think they inherited the Covenant. I think they acquired it. Specifically, deliberately. At exactly the right moment in the timeline to be present when the entity reached the saturation point. And I thought about what a person would want to be present for at a moment like that, and what they would need in order to be positioned correctly. And I thought about 37 names, and I thought about a schedule and a date in a spreadsheet column that was not a projection. I drove home the next morning in a particular kind of quiet. Not the quiet of a resolved question, there were no resolved questions, but the quiet of a situation that had been reclassified. I had come into this as a person who had been placed, without her consent, inside a mechanism she did not design and had not chosen. I was leaving the meeting still that person, but with a clearer view of the mechanism's full architecture, and with the understanding that the mechanism was currently in operation, not idling, not dormant, not a historical structure I had the option of examining from the outside. It was active. Something was managing it with a specific purpose, and the purpose was proximate. The entity in the house had been growing toward a threshold for 2 centuries, and the threshold was close, and the people who had positioned themselves to be present at the threshold had done so deliberately. I did not know their names or their intentions, but I knew that 37 designated witnesses, scattered and failing and ambient with something they couldn't locate, we were part of what was being managed. Whether we were the mechanism of control or the mechanism of release was the question I could not yet answer. What I understood, driving through the flat Midwestern morning with the sun entirely absent from a white sky, was that the answer would determine everything that happened next. If you were one of the 37 names, would you go to the meeting or would you run?